It might seem like a strange thing claiming that DOS gaming is superior because of multimedia. After all, the ability to use different forms of media in one title has been around for decades now. So what makes doing the exact same thing in the 80s and 90s any better? You'd think at this point I'd tell you the same thing over, like in the other topics I've discussed in this series, that creating a thing first is completely different than using someone else's creation at a later date. While DOS and early Windows machines didn't create multimedia first, they weren't off by much, and the efforts to integrate it into their systems were informed by their competitors. Over the years, I've been told repeatedly by my subscribers, and have personally lamented the fact that many games on DOS aren't the definitive versions, with more than a few of them being ports from other more capable systems at the time. The most obvious of these is Commodore's Amiga, a microcomputer released in the mid-80s that kickstarted the line of the same name. Their versions of games often sported higher resolutions, better color palettes, and superior sound. And alongside Atari's ST and Apple's Macintosh 2, home systems were finally competing with consoles in terms of visual and audio fidelity, rather than being seen as stuffy business systems for doing your spreadsheets on. Despite that perception, the 80s games for IBM computers prior to this evolution were still superior to their console brethren in many ways, being highly sophisticated due to keyboard control or technically sound thanks to genius programmers, or telling a fantastic story due to people like Roberta Williams and Steve Moretsky existing. But because they were limited to CGA and EGA palettes coupled with PC speaker beeps and boops, they couldn't match the competing systems on an audio-visual level. Many developers got their start in life by converting the code from one microcomputer system to run on another. The companies were aware of this disparity, leading to many terrible ports, but also their releasing of enhanced versions or remakes of older titles later when the hardware had caught up. Fortunately, this craze never caught on, or resulted in an endless and shameless parade of repackaged games banking cynically on the player's nostalgia. And catch up the hardware did. The IBM and its compatibles went from being behind the curve to superior than other home systems, thanks to multimedia expansion. The three biggest breakthroughs of the 80s that ushered in this era for PCs were the creation of the CD-ROM drive file system standard for computers, the video graphics array, and the Sound Blaster external expansion card, all appearing around the same time between 1987 and 1988. The 640 by 480 resolution, coupled with a minimum of 256 colors, and a dedicated external sound source, and a storage medium that could contain hundreds of megabytes, extended the capabilities of IBM and IBM compatibles far beyond their previous limits, especially if you had thousands spare in your bank account and stuck a 486 in there, which was introduced the year after in 1989. VGA in particular was also the last IBM graphics standard that clones and compatible manufacturers adhered to, forming a graphical baseline for all games developers to aspire towards, be they porting from other systems or writing from scratch. A series of computer manufacturers that made their name earlier in the decade by copying IBM's design, most notably companies like Hewlett-Packard, Compaq, and my personal favourite, Packard Bell, I had fond memories of them, were quick to capitalize on this new era of computing. But their components differed wildly when compared to the standardization of consoles. If you bought a Nintendo, you knew it was going to contain the same parts as another Nintendo. Likewise with an Atari ST, right? Seeing the disparity between the systems, the MPC standard was created by the Software Publishers Association, setting guidelines for what constituted the absolute minimum standard for what you could call a multimedia PC. You could use different brands and cards, but they all had to adhere to a certain standard for users. Initially in 1991, you needed a 386SX, 2 megs of RAM, a 30 megabyte hard drive, a VGA card capable of 640 by 480 and 256 colors, a CD-ROM drive with a seek time under a second that didn't use over 40% of the CPU to read, a sound card, preferably a Sound Blaster, outputting 8 bits of goodness through your speakers, Oh, and Windows 3.0, because Bill Gates was starting to take over the world. These standards were revised twice because of Moore's Law being in full flow, and as I stressed before, this was only the minimum. The DX2 turned up in 1992 to push the IBM compatibles over the edge, and was capable of running just about everything from the DOS era. So why all this talk of hardware? Because the leap from monochrome to CGA to EGA to VGA in the 80s was the most profound graphical advancement ever seen since the advent of computer graphics themselves. You went from one color to 256 colors in just 6 years. You went from PC speaker beeps to full digital soundtracks with audio sound effects playing in unison. And as for storage space, for games and software alike, it became between 486 and 1,806 times larger, depending on the floppy you wanted to compare it with, roughly speaking, because I'm terrible at math. That's a big difference in space to store your assets, and often meant you didn't need to install the entire game onto your hard drive, just a few key files to read from and write to. It was a gold rush era for creative types. They had chanced a sneak peek at what the future held for them, as the technologies had slowly started to be integrated into machines. But now it all came together as standard, and the former Frankenstein's monsters that were IBM compatibles continued to keep pace with consoles ever since, often outstripping them in the performance stakes. Multimedia opened the door for MIDI soundtracks, CD audio, FMV sequences, characters that talk to you using voice dialogue, and most importantly, it was all new and special. Developers who were constrained by previous hardware limitations of the 70s and 80s that they coded around skillfully were now honed to a sharpened edge because of it, and the proverbial shackles were lifted, allowing them to combine their talents with an audio-visual experience that expressed their initial vision in ways previously thought unimaginable. Do any of this today and it's just another game, just another soundtrack or texture or bit of voice dialogue. It's commonplace and often rote in the case of developers making the assets. There's no sense of wonder or excitement that can be extracted from it being new, because it isn't. The ground has been covered, and you're walking in very deep footsteps, irrespective of your own excitement over the project, unless you're a 1 in a million exception that actually designs something new and interesting. Chances are you aren't though. The era from the late 80s through to the 90s was lightning in a bottle, and it's not coming back unless there are astounding simultaneous technological leaps over the course of a few years at some point in the future. On a personal note, I actually want that to happen. I want to see embedded neural haptic feedback chips with true-to-reality experiences, or mind-based interfaces that can completely replace the controller. I want to see what clutch of developers rise to prominence off the back of a new technological evolution, partly because it's exciting to ponder whether the time you lived through is ever going to be repeated again, and partly because the modern gaming scene is so desperately dull, having been more or less the same for the past 20 years, that even dystopian mind control through video games would be a welcome change of pace from the drudgery. In the meantime though, I can look back at that glorious era of computing and smile, knowing just how many absolute classics of gaming were born during it, and most importantly, because of that period of time, many of which have never been better.